Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London with another watch video, and today we're comparing Audemars Piguet with Patek Philippe. I'm going to split this comparison up into a few different sections and then discuss the differences between the brands per section. As with all my reviews, let's start with the history. That will be our first section. So we're going to go back in time now to the late just the 1800s. Patek Philippe was actually founded in 1839, so incredibly long time ago. And then Audemars Piguet was founded a few years later in 1875. So Audemars Piguet is a slightly younger brand than Patek Philippe. And Patek Philippe has been producing watches for obviously almost 200 years now. But they were much more prominent in the market over that period of time, whereas Audemars Piguet has really only gained mega popularity in the last 50 years. Prior to the Royal Oak in the 70s, it wasn't as much of a name as Patek Philippe was. So the Royal Oak really changed it, which we'll come on to now. So both of them have always both brands have both positioned themselves kind of at the top end of the market in terms of quality, craftsmanship, finishing, and therefore they kind of position themselves naturally at the highest end of the price point as well. Both of them really were famed for their dress watches, and that's really what the brands did, was dress watches, until the 70s, which is when Gerald Genta designed both for Audemars Piguet and then later on for Patek Philippe, a steel sports watch, which was the Royal Oak for Audemars Piguet and the Nautilus from Patek Philippe, or for Patek Philippe. And those were really in the response to the quartz crisis in the late 1960s. That really saw a massive hit in the sales for Swiss watches. Those were really to try and attract a new audience, and they really were incredibly successful. Audemars Piguet was kind of popular prior to then, but not really much of a brand, like I said, nowhere near as big as Patek Philippe. But the Royal Oak completely transformed Audemars Piguet in the 70s and really made it such an important piece, and not just from Audemars Piguet, but actually in the whole watch industry. Patek Philippe has really remained as a dress watch company even now. That's their kind of primary line or primary focus is dress watches. The Nautilus, obviously, in the last 5 years, has really blown up and become much more popular than it used to be. But really, Patek, their DNA is dress watches, whereas Audemars Piguet, since the 70s, Audemars Piguet has really run with the Royal Oak. I mean, it's only kind of now that they're trying to explore other avenues. Yes, they have other models in their collection, but the Royal Oak really is what drives the majority of Audemars Piguet's sales. So technically, Audemars Piguet is almost a bit of a sports watch brand, but definitely at the extreme high end of that level, much more towards the dressy end than someone like Omega, Breitling or Rolex. So that concludes the basic history. Let's take a look at the next category, which is what kind of audience or age range these brands are appropriate for. Audemars Piguet definitely attracts much more of a younger audience than Patek Philippe. Patek Philippe is much more of a old school classic brand. The watches and the designs are incredibly classic. Their most kind of unusual or young watch is the Aquanaut, and even that is incredibly reserved and under the radar, and definitely still pretty classical looking. For example, back in the 90s, when both brands were looking at a way to try and attract a younger audience, because prior to that they were definitely only really attracting older audiences. So in the 90s, they both released a model or new line of models to attract this younger audience. Audemars Piguet released in 1993 the Royal Oak Offshore, which was a much bulkier design than the Royal Oak. It was actually designed by someone in their early 20s, so a very young watch designer, and it really did appeal to a younger audience. It did very well. And Patek Philippe's answer to that, to the Offshore, was their Aquanaut later on in the 1990s. The Aquanaut is, like I mentioned, very reserved. It's a pretty classic looking sports watch. It's not particularly out there at all. The Royal Oak Offshore is definitely much bulkier and in your face, and trying to show off that it's a special piece. I mean, that really says all. That's really the essence of both brands. Audemars Piguet always tries to push the boat in terms of innovation and coming up with new concepts and trying to be a bit more of a cooler, trendier brand. Patek Philippe is very much about being under the radar, very classic and elegant and just timeless. AP's designs, Audemars Piguet's designs, are much more experimental. They have many more experimental watches. The concept watches are, really futuristic looking, really interesting designs that Patek Philippe would never really dream of creating. They tend not to create prototypes or release kind of prototypes or concept watches. They tend to stick to their very classic designs. I mean, Audemars Piguet's own CEO is a very playful guy. His office is full of toys and things like that, and I've heard through the grapevine of people that I know that know him, they've said he's a really, really playful, fun person. So I think that filters down into the brand, and he's obviously trying to push that with Audemars Piguet to not be too serious. Yes, we've been going for well over 100 years, but we're still a really cool, forward-thinking, kind of trendy brand. An interesting thing to look at between the two brands is that Patek Philippe doesn't collaborate with celebrities or ambassadors. They don't sponsor any events, as far as I'm aware, and they don't market themselves with other companies or through sponsorships. They actually only market themselves through their own marketing schemes, which is pretty interesting because Audemars Piguet is quite the opposite. They have ambassadors, mostly in sports, and they're all really cool, funky people or interesting people within each industry. We've got the LeBron watch, we've got Arnold Schwarzenegger watch as well. We've got Serena Williams, who's got a sponsorship with Audemars Piguet, Messi, Sachin Tendulkar, all these amazing sports legends have done partnerships with Audemars Piguet, and they're all really cool in their own way. Next category we're going to look at is what materials the brands use, and that kind of stems from that conversation we just had about Audemars Piguet being a bit more experimental. AP uses a much wider range of materials, and just kind of unique materials outside of the standard ones that most watchmakers make. They use titanium, carbon, special different forms of carbon as well, ceramic. They're constantly using different coming up with new concepts of how to make a watch more and more unique and more futuristic. Their concept watches really show off how experimental they can be with their materials, whereas Patek Philippe only ever uses steel, white gold, yellow gold, rose gold and platinum. I've not seen any other metals from them. They just like to stick to the standard gold, steel and platinum. That's what Patek is about, being super classical and timeless. Next, moving on to production numbers. These are two estimations for the production numbers of both of the brands. So Audemars Piguet production number estimate is around 40,000 per year. Patek Philippe has an estimated production number of around 60,000 per year. So slightly higher much higher in fact with Patek Philippe, almost 50% higher. Patek Philippe doesn't really offer any publicly limited edition watches, but their production numbers are low anyway, compared to other brands. So the numbers are pretty low. You're not going to see many people with your Patek Philippe on, so which is nice. Many pieces are actually made to order from Patek though. In those cases, those watches are extremely rare, but again, they don't publicly say on their website, limited to 10 watches. It's by application often, these watches, and you don't always get accepted. Moving on to our next category, which is the finishing and craftsmanship of these two brands. Both of these brands finish their watches to an absolutely exceptional level. They are really kind of at the top end of finishing, in not just the cases, but also movements. And they really have been for many years. Patek Philippe definitely for many years has been famed for their finishing. And Audemars Piguet with the Royal Oak, showing a really complex level of finishing there, it has really helped them build a name for themselves in terms of being one of the greatest for finishing watches in difficult materials also like ceramic. I'd probably say though that Patek Philippe probably has a slightly higher level of finishing in terms of the case versus Audemars Piguet. It is very close and they both finish their cases to an exceptional level, but Patek just has the slight edge. There's a little bit more detail in Patek's versus Audemars Piguet. The actual design of the cases as well is actually a bit more complex also with Patek, and they have a much wider range of cases and case designs across the line. In fact, most models in their collection have a completely different case to the other, whereas Audemars Piguet obviously mainly uses the Royal Oak, and each one's just a scaled up or scaled down version of the next. Often they use the same cases for each model as well, or just slightly changed. The level of craftsmanship between these two brands is very similar, but Patek again has the slight edge here. They truly are the masters of watchmaking. Audemars Piguet is incredible, but Patek is just another level. Especially in the movements, that's where you really see the difference between these two brands. The movements in Audemars Piguet are absolutely stunning, and they really are truly beautiful to look at. but the depth and levels of finishing that Patek goes through, or you know, versus Audemars Piguet is far greater. You know, Patek, the attention level to detail is just unbelievable in their movements. They're polishing every single little screw head and chamfering the edges. Everything inside the movement is finished by hand to an exceptional standard, and that's how they gained the Geneva seal a few years ago, which now is replaced by the Patek Philippe seal. Kind of just recognizing how exceptional they really finish and the level of detail they really finish their movements to. Can't go wrong with either though in terms of finishing and craftsmanship, both beautiful. Patek has just the slight edge here though. Patek Philippe also has kind of the more complex movements or in-house movements versus Audemars Piguet, and they've been famous for that for many years. Patek has been innovating with movements, you know, throughout their whole entire timeline, whereas Audemars Piguet hasn't done that quite in the same way. They've often used external movements from external companies rather than in-house movements, which Patek kind of prides themselves in. But yeah, Patek like patented technology as well with movements, and they're trying to innovate with movements rather than with cases and materials. It's a kind of a different philosophy with Patek. But yeah, in terms of movements and complexities, Patek is far more complex than Audemars Piguet. Moving now on to our next category, which is pricing. There is a slight difference in price between these brands. It's definitely closing the gap though. Audemars Piguet is definitely pushing up their prices to come up to the Patek prices. Patek has mostly throughout the years been much more of an expensive brand versus AP, but Audemars Piguet is increasing their prices so much so, in fact, that the extra thin is actually more expensive than the Nautilus now. But that's kind of rare though. Most of the time, the equivalent watch, for example, I'm going to show you now, a Royal Oak rose gold chronograph, has a retail price of £55,200, and the kind of equivalent from Patek Philippe would be the 5980. Yes, the 5980 has a flyback chronograph, but it's pretty much identical in terms of what watch you're getting. The Patek is £67,450, so that's over, yes, over £12,000 more for the Patek versus the kind of equivalent Audemars Piguet watch. So generally they are more expensive. However, there are exceptions to that rule, and more now with Patek, with Audemars Piguet ramping up the prices, that gap is closing. Let's just discuss briefly about who these watches are for, who should be looking at Audemars Piguet or Patek Philippe. I'd say Patek is more so for an older audience, a more classic audience, someone who is going to be wearing dress watches for more special occasions perhaps, or definitely wears a suit every single day, or wants to have something for a dress watch for a dress dinner, just much more smarter occasions. That's what the Patek is about. The Audemars Piguet is more suitable for a younger audience, a more sporty person, man or woman, who wants to wear this kind of a more wider variety of occasions and events, and with a more wider variety of outfits as well. We are definitely seeing a change though, that younger audiences are now taking a look at Patek Philippe classic watches, which is really cool. I think the Nautilus has helped to bring some attention to their more classic pieces. Overall, which do I prefer, Patek Philippe or Audemars Piguet? I'm deep down a massive Audemars Piguet fan. I absolutely love the brand. It was my first luxury watch I bought was an Audemars Piguet offshore, Royal Oak offshore. So I think that's why I always will truly love AP. My dream watches though tend to be from Patek Philippe. I just love the classic designs, the smaller case sizes that Patek does. So for me, I'd have to choose Patek, but it's with some slight pain saying that, because truly deep down, Audemars Piguet for me is the best brand in the world. I just love how playful and how beautiful their designs are. Thanks guys for watching. Let us know in the comments which of these two brands you prefer. And as always, if you're interested in any of the watches mentioned in this video, then please don't hesitate to contact us. Our details are in the description. And also at the end of the video, it'd be a pleasure to call either watch into stock for you.